Alright, hi. I'm going to pick up where we left off, reading The Plague. Where were we? We are in the middle of part 2. We've just found out Teru isn't scared of death. He's kind of a nihilist. We read some of his journal. And found out that the asthmatic patient spends his whole day counting dried peas, and that's how he keeps track of time. We also had a description of people dying, and more of Father Panalu's sort of weird effect on the people, causing a panic by being overly religious about the plague. What's up, Nick? So, picking up again, this is still part 2. The Plague by Albert Camus. It was Teru who had asked Dr. Ryu for the interview he refers to in this diary. On that evening, as it happened, just before Teru arrived, the doctor had gazed for some moments at his mother, who was sitting very still in the corner of the dining room. Once her household tasks were over, she spent most of her time in that chair. Her hands folded in her lap, she sat there waiting. Dr. Ryu wasn't even sure it was for him that she was waiting. However, something always changed in his mother's face when he came in. The silent resignation that a laborious life had given it seemed to light up with a sudden glow. And then she would return to her tranquility. That evening she was gazing out of the window at the now empty street. The street lighting had been reduced by 2/3, and only at long intervals a lamp cast flickering gleams through the thick darkness of the town. "Will they keep the light down as long as the plague lasts?" she asked. "I think so," he said. "Let's hope it doesn't last until winter. It would be terribly depressing." "Yes," Dr. Ryu said. He saw his mother's gaze settle on his forehead. He knew that the worry and hard work of the last few days had scored their traces there. Hey, shh. "Didn't things go well today?" his mother asked. "No, it was the usual." The usual. That was to say, the new consignment of serum sent from Paris was less effective than the first consignment, and the death rate was going up. It was still impossible to administer any inoculations elsewhere than in families already attacked by the plague. If its use was to be generalized, a very large quantity of the vaccine was needed. Most of the buboes refused to burst. It was as if they underwent a hardening, and the victims would suffer horribly. During the last 24 hours, there had been 2 cases of a new form of this epidemic, the plague becoming pneumonic instead of bubonic. On this very day, in the course of a meeting, the much harassed doctors had pressed the prefect, this unfortunate man seeming quite at his wit's end, to issue new regulations to prevent contagion being carried from mouth to mouth, as happens with pneumonic plague. The prefect had done as they wished, but as usual they were groping more or less in the dark. Looking at his mother, he felt an uprush of half-forgotten emotion, the love of his boyhood, as the sight of her soft brown gaze intent on him. "Don't you ever feel alarmed, Mother?" he said. "Oh, at my age there isn't anything left to fear. The days are very long, and just now I'm not even at home much." "I don't mind waiting for you," she said, "as long as I know you're going to come back. And when you aren't here, I think about what you might be doing. Have you any news?" "Yes," he said, "if I'm to believe the last telegram, everything's going as well as could be expected. But I know she says that to prevent me from worrying." The doorbell rang. The doctor gave his mother a smile and went to open the door. In the dim light of the landing, Teru looked like a big gray bear. Dr. Ryu gave his visitor a seat facing his desk, while he himself remained standing behind the chair. Between them was the only light in the room, a desk lamp. Teru came straight to the point. "I know," he said, "that I can talk to you quite frankly." Dr. Ryu nodded. "In 2 weeks, or a month at most," he said, "you won't have any purpose here. Things will be out of hand." Dr. Ryu agreed. The sanitary department is not efficient. It's understaffed, and you're worked off your feet. Dr. Ryu admitted this. Well, Teru said, I've heard that the authorities are thinking of sort of a conscription of the population, and that men in good health should be required to help fight the plague. This is correct, said Ryu, but the authorities are in none too good odor as it is, and the prefect can't make up his mind. If he doesn't risk drafting us, why doesn't he call for volunteers? Teru said. It's been done, said Dr. Ryu. Nobody responded. Well, it was done through official channels, and half-heartedly. What they're short on is imagination. The officials can never cope with something really catastrophic. Officialdom and the remedial measures they think up are barely even adequate for a common cold. If we let them keep going like this, they'll soon be dead, and so will we. That's more than likely, said Dr. Ryu. I should tell you, however, that they're thinking of using the prisoners in the jail for what we call heavy work. I'd rather see free men employed, said Teru. A death sentence is not every man's sentence. So would I, said the doctor. But might I ask why you feel this way? I hate men being condemned to death. Ryu looked Teru in the eyes. So what do we do? He asked. It's this. I've drawn up a plan for voluntary groups of helpers. Get me empowered to try out my plan, and let's sidetrack the official welfare. In any case, the authorities have their hands more than full. I have friends in every walk of life, and they'll form a nucleus to start from, and of course I'll take part myself. I can hardly tell you that I accept your suggestion most gladly, said Dr. Ryu. One can't have too many helpers, especially in a job like mine with the present conditions. I'll try to get your plan approved by authorities. They don't really have a choice. But, he pondered, I take it you know that work of this kind may prove fatal to the worker. And I feel I should ask you this. Have you weighed these dangers? Teru's gray eyes met the doctor's serenely. What do you think of Panalu's sermon, Doctor? The question was asked in a very ordinary tone, and Ryu answered the same way. I've seen too much of hospitals to relish any idea of collective punishment. But you know, Christians sometimes say those kind of things without really thinking it. They're better than they seem. However, Teru said, you think like Panalu, that the plague has a good side. It opens men's eyes and forces them to think? The doctor tossed his head. Every ill that flesh is heir to does this. What's true of all the evils in the world is true of the plague as well. It helps men rise above themselves. And all the same, when you see the misery it brings, you'd need to be a madman, a coward, or stone blind to give in tamely to the plague. Ryu hardly raised his voice at all, but Teru made a slight gesture as if to calm him down. He was smiling. Dr. Ryu shrugged. Yes. But you haven't answered my question yet. Have you weighed the consequences of these decisions? Teru squared his shoulders against the back of the chair and then moved his head forward into the light. Do you believe in God, Doctor? Again in a very ordinary tone. But this time Dr. Ryu took longer to think. No. But what does that really mean? I'm fumbling in the dark and trying to make something out. Isn't that it? Said Teru. The gulf between you and Father Panalu. I doubt it, said the doctor. Panalu is a man of learning, a scholar. He hasn't come in contact with death. That's why he can speak with such assurance of the truth with a capital T. Every country priest who actually visits his parishioners and has heard a man gasping for breath on his deathbed thinks like I do. He would try to relieve human suffering before trying to point out its good side. Dr. Ryu stood up, and his face was in shadow. Let's drop this subject, since you won't answer my question. Teru remained seated. He was still smiling. Suppose I answer your question with a question of my own. And the doctor smiled again. You like to be mysterious. Okay, fire away. My question is this, said Teru. Why do you show such devotion, considering you don't believe in God? I suspect your answer may help answer mine. His face still in shadow, the doctor said he'd already answered, that if he believed in an all-powerful God, he would stop curing the sick and just leave it to him. But no one in the world believed in that kind of God, not even Father Panalu, who believed that he believed in such a God. And this was proved by the fact that no one ever really threw himself completely on Providence. And anyhow, in this respect, Dr. Ryu believed himself to be on the right road, in fighting against creation as he found it. "Aha," said Teru, "that's the idea you have of your profession." "More or less," said the doctor, with his face coming back into the light. Teru made a whistling noise with his lips, and the doctor looked at him. "Oh, you're thinking I'm prideful. But I'm assuring you, I have no more pride than what's needed to keep me going. I have no idea what's awaiting me, or what will happen when this all ends. For the moment, the only thing I know is that there are sick people, and they need curing, and later on, perhaps, they'll think about things, and so will I. But right now, all I have to do is try to make them well, and defend them as best as I can." "Against whom?" said Teru. Ryu turned to the window. A shadow line on the horizon told of the presence of the sea. He was conscious only of his exhaustion, and at the same time was struggling against a sudden, irrational impulse to unburden himself more to his companion, an eccentric, perhaps, but who he guessed was one of his own kind. "I don't know who, Teru. I assure you I don't have a notion. When I entered this profession, this job, I did it abstractedly, because I had a desire for it, because it meant a career, one that young men often aspire to. Perhaps it was difficult for a workman's son like myself, and that attracted me. And then I had to see people die. Did you know that there are people who refuse to die? Have you ever heard a woman scream, 'No, never,' with her very last breath? I have. And then I saw that I could never get hardened to it. I was young then, and I was outraged by this entire scheme of things, or so I thought. Later on, I grew more modest, but I've never managed to get used to seeing people die. That's all I know. And after all," he fell silent and sat down and felt his mouth go suddenly dry. "After all?" Teru prompted softly. "After all," the doctor repeated, and then fixed his eyes on him. "It's something that a man of your sort can understand. But since the order of the world is shaped by death, wouldn't it be better for God if we refused to believe in him and struggled with all our might against death, without raising our eyes toward the heaven where he sits in silence?" Teru nodded. "Yes, but your victories will never last, that's all." At this, the doctor's face darkened. "I know this, but it's no reason for stopping the struggle." "No reason, I agree. Only I can now picture what this plague must mean for you." "Yes," said the doctor. "It's a never-ending defeat." Teru stared at the doctor for a moment, and then turned and walked heavily toward the door. Dr. Ryu followed him and was almost to his side when Teru, who was staring at the floor, suddenly said, "Who taught you these things, doctor?" The reply came promptly. "Suffering taught me." Dr. Ryu opened the door of his surgery and told Teru that he too was going out. He had a patient to visit in the suburbs. Teru suggested they should go together, and he agreed. And in the hall they encountered Ryu's mother, and the doctor introduced Teru to her. "A friend of mine," he said. "Indeed," she said. "I'm very pleased to meet you." And when she left them, Teru turned to gaze after her. On the landing, the doctor turned on the lights along the stairs, but the stairs remained dark. Possibly a new light-saving order had come into force. But really there was no knowing. For some time past, in the streets and in private houses, everything was going out of order. It might be only that the concierge, like almost everyone else in town, had stopped bothering about his duties. The doctor had no time to follow up his thoughts because Teru's voice came from behind him. "I have just one more question, doctor, even if it sounds to you a little bit like nonsense. You're perfectly right, did you know?" The doctor shrugged. "To tell the truth, it's outside my range, but what do you know about it?" Teru replied coolly, "I have very little left to learn." Ryu paused, and behind him, Teru's foot slipped on a step. He steadied himself by gripping onto the doctor's shoulder. "Do you really imagine you know everything about life?" the doctor asked. The answer came through the darkness in the same cool tone. "Yes." Once in the street, they realized it must be quite late, maybe even 11. Everything in the town was silent except for some vague rustling. An ambulance bell clanged faintly in the distance. They stepped into the car, and Ryu started the engine. "Come to the hospital tomorrow," he said, "for an injection. But before starting this adventure, you'd better know your chances of coming out of it alive. 1 in 3. That sort of reckoning doesn't hold water, and you know it, Doctor. 100 years ago, plague wiped out the entire population of a town in Persia with one exception. The sole survivor was the man whose job it was to wash the dead bodies, and who kept working throughout this epidemic." "He pulled off his 1 in 3 chance," said Dr. Ryu. "But you're right, we don't know anything on the subject." They were entering the suburbs, and the headlights lit up the empty streets. The car stopped. Standing in front of it, the doctor asked Teru if he'd like to come in. Teru said yes. A glimmer of light from the sky lit up their faces, and Ryu gave a short laugh, with a lot of friendliness in it. "Spill it, Teru. What on earth prompted you to take a hand in this?" "Oh, I don't know. My code of morals, maybe." "Your code of morals? What code?" "Comprehension," Teru said. He then turned toward the house, and Ryu did not see his face again until they were in the old asthma patient's room. The next day, Teru set to work and enrolled the first team of workers, soon to be followed by many others. However, it is not my intention to ascribe to these sanitary groups more importance than they are due. Doubtless, today, many of our fellow citizens are apt to yield to the temptation of exaggerating the services they rendered. But the narrator here is inclined to think that by attributing overimportance to praiseworthy actions, we can, by implication, be paying indirect but potent homage to the worst side of human nature. Because this attitude implies that such actions shine out as a rare exception, while callousness and apathy are the general rule. The narrator does not share this view. The evil that is in the world always comes from ignorance, and good intentions may do as much harm as malevolence if they lack understanding. On the whole, people are more good than bad, but that's not the real point. They are more or less ignorant, and it is this that we call vice or virtue. The most incorrigible vice being that of an ignorance that fancies it knows everything and therefore claims for itself the right to kill. The soul of a murderer is blind, and there can be no true goodness or true love without the utmost clear-sightedness. And so the sanitary groups, whose creation was entirely Teru's work, should be considered objectively as well as with approval. And this is why we decline to vaunt in an overglowing terms of courage or devotion, to which is attributed only a relative and reasonable importance. We will continue to chronicle the troubled, rebellious hearts of the townspeople under the impact of the plague. Those who had enrolled in the sanitary squads, as they were called, had indeed no such great merit in doing as they did, since they knew it was the only thing to be done. And the unthinkable thing would have been not to have brought themselves to do it. These groups enabled the townsfolk to come to grips with the disease, and convinced them that, now that the plague was among us, it was up to them to do whatever could be done to fight it. Since plague became in this way many men's duty, it revealed itself as to what it really was. That is, the concern of everyone. So far, so good. But we don't congratulate a schoolmaster on teaching that 2 and 2 make 4, although we may congratulate him on choosing his vocation. Let's say, then, it was praiseworthy that Teru and so many others should have elected to prove that 2 and 2 make 4, rather than the contrary. But let us add that this goodwill of theirs is one that is shared by the schoolmaster, and by everyone who has the same feelings as them. And to the credit of mankind, they are more numerous than one might think. Such, anyhow, is the narrator's conviction. Needless to say, we can see quite clearly a point that could be made against him, which is that these men were risking their lives. But again and again, there comes a time in history when a man who dares to say that 2 and 2 make 4 will be punished with death. The schoolteacher is aware of this, and the question is not one of knowing what punishment or reward attends the making of the calculation. The question is that of knowing, do 2 and 2 make 4? For those of our townsfolk who risked their lives in this predicament, the issue was whether or not the plague existed, and whether or not they must fight it. Many fledgling moralists in those days were going about the town proclaiming there was nothing to be done about it. or that it shouldn't be worried about, and that one should bow to the inevitable. And Teru, Dr. Ryu, and their friends might give one answer or another, but the conclusion was always the same. The certitude that a fight must be put up, in some way, and that there must be no bowing down to the pestilence. The essential thing was to save the greatest number possible of persons from dying or being doomed to unending separation. And to do this, there was only one resource: to fight the plague in every manner necessary. There was nothing admirable about this attitude. It was simply logical. So, at this point, I'm going to stop. I will read tomorrow. I'm not taking any more days off for a little while. So, we are probably one reading away from being at part 3. Part 3 is coming up very soon. So, probably tomorrow we'll finish part 2. I might do a little chat session tomorrow earlier in the day. I'm going to wave to everybody. Yes, everyone feels like a madman right now. That's... yeah. Everybody. So I'm going to save this, and then I'll read more tomorrow, and yeah, the plague. Be safe out there.